Thank you, Jason. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Danielle Matsuo and I'm the Statewide Manager of Programs for Corrective Services New South Wales. It is my very great privilege to introduce our first speaker this morning, Professor James Ogloff. For me, as a forensic psychologist myself, with corrective services for almost 17 years, his knowledge and expertise is certainly something that I aspire to. I was first trained by him in risk assessment of offenders, probably right at the very start of my career, and I developed a very specific interest in this area, particularly the assessment of serious sexual and violent offenders. And I continue to look at Jim's work as most definitely a best practice model in our field. So let me tell you a little bit about him. James Ogloff is a trained lawyer and psychologist. He is a fellow of the Canadian, American and Australian Psychological Societies. He's the Foundation Professor of Forensic Behavioural Science and Director of the Centre for Forensic Behavioural Science at Swinburne University of Technology. He's the Director of Psychological Services and Research at the Victorian Institute of Forensic Mental Health, known as Forensicare. He's worked in clinical and forensic psychology in a variety of settings for more than 30 years. Professor Ogloff was appointed as a member of the Order of Australia, AM, in 2015 for significant service to education and to the law as a forensic psychologist, as an academic, a researcher and a practitioner. Professor Ogloff has specific expertise in forensic psychology, forensic mental health law and the assessment and management of offenders. He served as British Columbia's first Director of Mental Health Services for Corrections in Canada. He has published he's published 17 books, more than 225 scholarly articles and book chapters. He's the recipient of the 2012 Donald Andrews Career Contributions Award for Criminal Justice Psychology from the Canadian Psychological Association and the 2009 Award for Distinguished Contributions in Forensic Psychology from the Australian Psychological Society. Please welcome Professor James Ogloff.
I was just writing an article there while she was speaking. It is a great pleasure to be here. First of all, to be in Sydney, right? It's lovely. But second, to be in front of this group, because to me, of course, the frontline people are the most important people. Very often we focus our attention on policymakers and more senior staff, but of course it's the frontline people that make things work or not work, as the case may be. Now, Craig mentioned being nervous here. I get nervous at these things too. And of course, you can't help but think what might go wrong. Just let me give you an example. I came to Australia around 2000, and one of the first things I was asked to do is address the Australian-New Zealand psychiatry group, the Royal College of Psychiatrists, which was a great privilege. I got telephoned by someone in Queensland, so I thought naturally this meant a holiday to Queensland. Then he said, well, it'll be in Hobart. So I thought, oh, Hobart, who wants to go there? But I did go there, and to make matters worse, they'd like me to speak on a Sunday. Oh, that's fine. It turns out it was Mother's Day. I've had 3 young children at the time, all grown now. So what I did is I, of course, took my family for a holiday to Tasmania. Now, I was speaking Sunday afternoon, and so we had to check out of the hotel. So we got everything out of the hotel. We took the kids somewhere. I was dressed in jeans, very casual. I had put my suit in the hotel where they store bags, and we got back to the hotel a little bit late, but I still had about 10 minutes to quickly change before I was going to do my keynote address in their Performing Arts Center, which is 2 levels with balconies filled with psychiatrists. So I went, my son, who was about 6 at the time, accompanied me into the men's bathroom. I took off my dirty clothes, put them in a bag, gave them to him. He took off to the car. They were going out for the afternoon. And then I began to dress. Much like I am today, I started, put the shirt on, put the tie on, put the pants on, but no pants. I couldn't find my pants. I'm in the toilet stall with no pants, realizing I got to speak to about 1,000 psychiatrists in 5 minutes. So I naturally panicked. So what I did is I, without thinking, opened the toilet stall and motioned the first guy, a guy much like you, a young man, a decent-looking man, I might add, went like that. So he's laughing. On the day, the young man didn't laugh. He looked more panic-struck, and he departed. So I closed the stall and began to think, what will I do? And I decided what I would do is sit there the entire afternoon, and that surely my family would come and find me at the end, because there's no way I was going out into this area with no pants on. So I did that, was my great plan, and about probably what felt like a long time, but maybe 2 minutes later, there was more noise in the bathroom, and I looked out, and there was an older man, maybe like you or you, but still decent looking, I might add. And so I went, can you help me out? I got a problem. And he was an old psychiatrist, as it turned out, very comfortable in his sexuality. And he said to me, what's the problem? And I explained the problem. And so what he did is he went, and of course what had happened is the pants had fallen off the hanger, and they were in a heap in the middle of the baggage area. So I was rescued. And then what happened is when I went out to speak, I was still very nervous and never told anybody that story, but I realized, thank God, because it was much like this where you had to walk across the group, walk up the stage, and it was a podium which was actually on a post, so I couldn't have gotten away, because one of the plans early on was sneak in there early and stand in front of the podium. So you can see sometimes your anxiety, it really comes to something, but hopefully today it won't. So I wanted to also thank very much the organizing committee. This is a huge undertaking, as we've heard from the commissioner and from Rosemary, in terms of how logistically difficult it is, but how important it is. And I wanted to thank Jason, who briefed me on the presentation, and Danielle for her kind introduction. This is a bit like those shows where they start cutting you off on the Oscars when you've spoken too long. Now, I don't have to tell you as a group how important community corrections is. The reality is that community corrections is the most important aspect of any correctional service, because the only change that's meaningful that offenders make has to happen in the community. So prisons are critical around community protection and sowing the seeds for change, but real change occurs, of course, in the community, and particularly change that the public cares about, which is they don't want these people reoffending. The downside, of course, is that community corrections is also where everything bad happens that the public cares about. And so community corrections, because the media typically reports more on negative than on positive, often has bad press. And certainly in Victoria, that's happened. You will have seen many cases in Victoria over the last few years where individuals who were very high risk ended up often killing people. There are 3 high-profile cases, the last of which was a person called Sean Price, who murdered a young woman, about 17 years old, for no apparent reason. So what I wanted to do this morning in terms of setting the stage for the conference is talk a bit about the roles of community corrections in managing general offending. And so I'm just going to start this presentation, which I think should be ready to go. Famous last words. And what I want to do is really, you see that's a beautiful picture, that's a mountain. I'm from the mountains in Canada, so I'm always sort of homesick for that. And of course your task in community corrections is to get up that mountain. And so what I'm going to do in the presentation is talk about the journey that community corrections has taken, and corrections generally, to get up the mountain. And of course the starting point of all this in my time is really what's called nothing works. Now some of you will have done criminology and you'll know about this, but really in the early to mid 1970s, a number of people in the United States were funded a lot of money to evaluate, how can you change offending? And they were mostly left-wing criminologists, and their fundamental belief was that things like prisons didn't work. But this backfired terribly. And what happened was, in particular, a criminologist called Robert Martinson, worked with a team of people, and they developed a report which was very, very influential. And this report really looked at the extent to which corrections and other things changed behavior. And what they concluded is nothing works. And what they meant is nothing works. They didn't mean treatment doesn't work. They didn't mean community correction supervision doesn't work. They meant nothing works. Putting people in prison doesn't reduce reoffending. Arresting more people doesn't reduce offending, and so on and so forth. So their conclusion was nothing works. And you can see a couple of quotes. With few isolated exceptions, the rehabilitative efforts that have been reported so far have had no appreciable effect our present strategies cannot overcome or even appreciably reduce the powerful tendencies of offenders to continue in criminal behavior. So this really got a lot of press. You can see that. So in America, look who's the president, and basically it hit a real interesting time. People magazine featured it. It was also featured on the American version of 60 Minutes, and it got a massive amount of attention. Now what happened is, for a period of time, which has just ended now really, America completely changed around offending. They stopped parole in most states, and they also would reward states with federal money for what they called truth in sentencing. So what would happen is, if a state, say someone had a 5-year sentence, they would get additional funding if the people were actually kept in prison for 95% of the sentence. So there was a financial incentive not to have any community supervision at the end of sentencing. And that's also the period where all the American policies came in, like 3 strikes and so on and so forth. And also, it was really just in that period. The death penalty had stopped in 1972, and it recommenced in 1976. So we only see now in America what they're calling justice reinvestment. And of course, all of us think it's hilarious, because for so many years they didn't put any money in. Now, the sad part of the story, and there are many sad parts, is that Martinson actually tried to advocate for some very, very different things, such as, I'll just give you one example, having increased the number of police, but make them case managers. So the idea was, rather than putting people in prison, assign, say, 10 people to a police officer, and the officer's job is to essentially monitor them in a random sort of way. And the criminologists believed that would be a more effective way at reducing crime. If the criminals thought, oh, this guy could be visiting me at any time, I have to check in all the time with this person. Now, of course, none of that ever happened. And the end of the story is a very tragic one, because Martinson actually jumped out the window of his Manhattan apartment and committed suicide in front of his teenage son. He was despondent. No one knows exactly how much this contributed to it, but he was despondent, because, of course, they didn't want things to get worse. They wanted things to get better. Now, what was very important about that time is, because of the very negative tone it set, people who worked in prisons, many people whose names you probably know. One is Andrews from the Bonta and Andrews, the author of the LSI, who's now dead, sadly. But he was a young psychologist working in prisons. And the people who were working, they realized people do change. We see it. People change. And so what they did is they began to undertake studies to say, how can we make people change? How can we assist and facilitate change? And so for 25 years now, it's very clear that correctional intervention in broad ways can actually reduce offending. And that's at the prison and, of course, in the community. Now, this is a quote. Obviously stupid to put a quote like that up in a room like this where you probably can't see the screen. Did you bring your opera glasses? You could be looking at that. So this is just basically the first major study by a guy called Paul Gendreau, who's still alive, who's a forensic psychologist who always worked in corrections and with offenders, and a criminologist called Ross. But what they're saying is they actually look very carefully at programs, and they actually found that programs were changing people already by as much as 20 to 80%. So there was good evidence for change. So what's happened between that time, the late 80s, early 90s, and now has been really what you could call almost a revolution in our ability to make meaningful change in populations. And so many jurisdictions in the world that have adopted all these practices actually now see the lowest rates of reoffending in history. And so that's a very, very strong message. So what I want to do is highlight some of these things. Now, the year before he died, Martinson actually recanted. And he went back to the report, and he actually pointed to a plethora of, that means a lot, professors like to use these words. He pointed to this large number of rehabilitative models that actually worked. And he said these results are startling and positive. So this actually was trying to undo some of what had been done, but it was too late. And I was a Canadian, but I went to the United States initially in 1986, and that was very much the tone, is that you couldn't do anything and just put them in prison, keep them in prison, and execute the occasional one for good measure. Now, what is the winning framework? So the very heart of what we've learned is the answer to the question, why do people reoffend, or why do people offend in the first place? And I'm not going to go into huge detail on this, but essentially, through psychology, people began to realize that people essentially learn to offend in the way they learn other things, and they get reinforced for that behavior. And for them, offending is functional, even though it might cause a lot of difficulty, including them occasionally getting arrested. But it is a functional way of living in a society. And so, obviously, there's some people who don't fit that bill. There's some people who are, say, natural-born killers, people who might be, for whatever reason, particularly difficult, or people who are very mentally ill or unwell and so forth. But generally speaking, people learn through a variety of ways to offend. And so this is what the beginning of the story is. And this came from a psychologist who's now about 85, who's at Stanford University. And he's a very interesting man himself. He grew up in a very small town in northern Canada. And in Canada, when in his generation, people got free land. So his parents were actually given, they were from Europe, free land. So if you moved to Canada, you got a farm for free. My family did that. Imagine that, all these poor Europeans, and you could go and get a farm. So they go across the world at the time, and guess what the farm is? A plot of land in northern Alberta where it's routinely minus 40 in the winter. So already it snowed, and it's just the beginning of autumn there. And he basically learned as a young man, he was not like other people. He was very smart. He was educated at home. He went to university eventually, and he began to study psychology. And at the time, they were taught that learning is really, if I want to teach you something, I reinforce your behavior, or I give you a reward, these sorts of things. And he said, this is not how humans learn. Humans learn by their brain, by observing. And so he developed social learning theory, the idea that we learn by our society, and whatever level that is, and by things like reinforcement. So he's then applied that to crime, and of course that was adopted by Anders and Bonta. So what has happened over time is the pendulum swings between rehabilitation and punishment. And I do have a worry at the moment in Australia that we're sort of not sure which way to go, because certainly in Victoria, for many years now, the last government in particular really went tough on punishment. So Victoria traditionally had the lowest incarceration rates and the lowest reoffense rates. That's all changed. Massive incarceration increase. And interestingly, an Ombudsman's report in the last 2 weeks shows that the highest rates of reoffending as well, more than 10% increase over about 10 years. So that's something we always worry about. We want to always make sure we're trying to change behavior rather than punish behavior. Because one thing we know for sure is punishment doesn't work. And that's something that I think one of the first things I learned working in a prison, and first I worked with youth, that even more powerful, is if you want to make someone a criminal, put them in a youth detention center, particularly when they're vulnerable, young, they have no identity, and they basically have to learn to be tough in order to get into the hierarchy, and they're reinforced not by the staff, but by their peers for being difficult and tough. So punishment itself doesn't work. We know that. There's no study anywhere that demonstrates that punishment actually reduces a behavior in offending. Countries like America, which retain the death penalty, there are many studies that show there's no reduction in offending as a result of that. Canada eliminated the death penalty in the 60s, partly from research showing it didn't reduce offending at all. So punishment, even harsh punishment, doesn't really have much value. So what does work? Well, what works, of course, is having the notion that rather than punishing and incarcerating and trying to make things more and more difficult, we actually have to identify what are the problems and limitations with people, why are they offending, and try to begin to change that at different levels. Your level, which is the frontline, individual, hardcore level, but as a society, stepping back at broad levels. And in Australia in particular, in Aboriginal culture, Aboriginal society, this is a huge problem. We have the highest incarceration rate in the world of Indigenous people. We incarcerate more Aboriginal people than blacks were ever incarcerated in apartheid South Africa. The only population in the world that has a higher rate of incarceration are African Americans. So you don't want to catch up to the United States in that area. But that gives you an example of how much work there is to do. So the model that has worked, which people know about, is the risk needs responsivity model. And this model was developed again by Andrews and Bonta, who I mentioned Andrews before. Bonta, who just retired, he worked his whole life in prisons, initially out of jail for many, many years, more than 20 years, and then ultimately went into a research role and retired as Director of Research for the Government of Canada for Corrections. And they developed this model, which I think you know well. I'm just going to highlight features of the model because they're things that we do now, hopefully, almost naturally in corrections, and in particular, community corrections. So evidence shows that this model actually does work, and it's the only model that has strong empirical support, simple. So you'll hear things about other things. People get excited. They'll develop something. Have you heard of the Good Lives model? How many studies support that? How many studies show that it reduces offending? What do you think? 0. Not one. I was at a conference in England. A respected professor went through evidence for risk needs responsivity, and she's not someone who's in a camp. She's an independent academic. And then she said, let's look at the evidence for Good Lives model, and she put up a blank slide because there's lots of talk, but there's no actual evidence for it. And it makes good sense to middle-class people that people offend because they have bad lives and we have to give them good lives. But that's nonsense. Most offenders don't think their lives are all that bad. They're not a miserable group of people as a group. That's something that always shocked me working with offenders. They're pretty happy with their lives. They just wish we were less in their face. Do you find that? You talk, what do you do for your day? I get up about 11, have a smoke, go out, catch up with some friends, then do something in the afternoon, and then, go to the pub or whatever, and the cycle starts over and over. So the first principle, which everybody knows and takes to heart, is the risk principle. And this is the most important thing for community corrections. One of the things I did a few years ago, I was asked, there were a number of offenders who were on parole, and they committed murder. And the Herald Sun picked up, there were about 11. And so I was asked to review these cases in detail. And the thing I'd identified is the community management of the people was fraught. There was no hierarchical management. So you had individuals, including a man whose coronial inquest for his next victim is going on now, who had already committed a savage murder of a young girl, was very psychopathic and high risk. Prison psychologists talked about his anger to women and his thoughts about harming women. And he was paroled. And what did he do? He killed another woman, a young woman, and put her body in one of the rubbish bins, filled it with concrete. He wasn't smart enough to know that might be hard to move. Tried to enlist friends, no one would help him. And so there in this garage lied this body. And of course, you see in the evidence, when the body was found, or the bin was found, they x-rayed it, and there's a body in this bin. So that man, when he was released, he was supervised by a very junior community corrections officer who hadn't had much experience. He was meant to have assessment and treatment in programs. He didn't even get assessed, let alone any treatment, and so on and so forth. And he, in fact, killed this woman just at the end of parole. So it wasn't really a parole failure, but none of his behavior had really changed. So that's where risk becomes very important. So the idea is that we have to provide more supervision, more support, more intervention with higher risk people. But often the opposite occurs. In fact, when I was a frontline staff member, I knew I did that. It's very hard work. Fridays, I'd be tired. I'd choose to speak to people I liked. My Friday afternoon, as a prison psychologist, would be talking to a couple of people I liked rather than really hard work with people. So what shows, and this is an example from a recent Canadian study, because sometimes people think, oh, this is old and we know this. This is just an example. If you look at this graph at one of these screens, what you'll see on the left, that's the percentage of people who reoffend. And then there's really 4 groups. There's high-risk people who receive treatment, intensive treatment, and high-risk people who have no treatment. And then there's low-risk people who receive intensive treatment and low-risk people who receive no treatment. So the high-risk group are blue bars. So if you look at the high-risk group, first of all, what you see is the blue box. On the right, no treatment, reoffending, about 50%. But when they get intensive treatment, what does the reoffense rate drop to? 30%. That's very dramatic. And you'd think your programs are successful. But look at the low-risk group, what happens. The low-risk group that receives no treatment reoffends at about 15%. The one in the intensive treatment cohort reoffends at about 30%. It actually increases. So the idea is if we over-supervise, if we over-treat low-risk people, at best it'll have no effect, and at worst it may increase offending. If we don't intensively supervise and treat high-risk people, obviously we have great problems coming. So that's very quickly the risk principle. The need principle is really the most important principle for you in addition to sort of triaging, which is what the risk principle tells us. The risk principle tells us you triage people, and what they've done now in Victoria is the serious and violent offenders are supervised by people called principal practitioners, community corrections staff who are very experienced, very well trained, and they supervise small caseloads of very serious people, whereas the low-risk people are supervised by more mainstream staff. The need principle tells us what to do with people. And this is the most important thing, because that's what we've learned over the last 30 years. So 30 years ago, in corrections around the world, there were very few real programs, and the programs that existed were usually very psychological or very sort of employment structured. So when I first worked in a prison, we were doing things like deep muscle relaxation, stress management, self-actualization. This is why I'm not a fan of Good Lives, because we did Good Lives. That's what we used to do. Because we were psychologists, mostly we had no training in forensic, it didn't exist, and therefore what we did is we thought, why do people offend? Well, they have low self-esteem, they have all these other problems, and we'll treat them and they won't reoffend. Of course, that didn't work. So what the needs principle has taught us is what we focus on. And so these become what we call the central 8 factors, which you know about. Most important really is antisocial attitudes and antisocial peers. And this comes back to learning. People learn by their peers, and that learning affects their attitudes. So offenders differ from non-offenders in their attitudes and their values. And even in areas like another professor in our center studies aggression and violence. And people who are aggressive and violent perpetually, they have different ways of thinking. They routinely entertain violence and aggression as a way of managing their sort of behavior. So the central 8 risk factors are the most important areas to address, both in prison intervention and, of course, in the community. Now, at the same time, there are a bunch of things that are non-criminogenic needs. So these are needs people might have, and if we address them, and some need to be addressed, like mental illness, medical needs and the like, but they're not going to reduce offending. And this, I certainly found this out the hard way. I was director of mental health services for the prisons and rehabilitation, and we invested a huge amount of money in mental health, and I got a lot of money by saying, we'll reduce offending. So many people are mentally ill, treat mental illness, you'll reduce offending. We had 0 reduction in offending after several $1 million of investment in mental health. Now, that's not to say they didn't need mental health services. They certainly do. But it didn't affect the reduction of offending. And the research shows that even mentally ill people offend for the same reason other people do. So finally, we have the responsivity principle, which is, again, the idea, and this is what you have to do in your work. You have to tailor supervision, intervention, language, everything to the individual style of the person you're dealing with. And in our multicultural, diverse society, that means a lot of different things. That you really need to make sure that they have the capacity and that they have things like motivation and so forth. So I noticed on the tables, you're going to have motivational interviewing, training, and more training. That's very important because that's a very important part of responsivity. So in a nutshell, these principles come together and they tell us how to intervene. And these are examples of responsivity factors that are important and you need to take into account. So coming back, for example, to mental illness, if someone's unwell and mentally ill, they're not able to focus on things like positive change or programs, and they're not able often to comply with orders. So you need to have intervention for that, that in and of itself won't reduce offending, but it'll make them then amenable to other sort of supervision and intervention. Does that make sense to people? So there is a myth that these things cause offending. There was a case in Tasmania, I'm picking on Tasmania today, where an ABC presenter of The Collectors was found to possess something like 15,000 child pornography images. Do people remember this? And a psychologist dutifully assessed him and wrote, he's anxious and depressed, and this is why he's doing this. Now, I've had some anxiety and depression. I've been a psychologist for a long time. People don't spontaneously start downloading child pornography, right? You might do it more, but it doesn't cause you to do it. So that's ridiculous. Same with depression doesn't cause people to commit crime. Very few people commit crime because of mental illness specifically. Okay? So that doesn't mean we don't address those things, but in doing it without addressing other things, we're not going to reduce offending. So where does that take us? Well, how important is this? It's critically important. If we don't do these things, again, there's no evidence in the world that programs and correctional services change behavior that don't implement these sorts of issues. That's just the reality. And to give you an example of one of the things I think is critical is one of the problems I see is that we're often now focusing too much on specific offense type, even with respect family violence. So it is the case in family violence that some family violence perpetrators, that's the only kind of offending they do. But I've done work in that area, and it shows very clearly that most of the people who are family violence perpetrators have other offending as well. And the men's behavioral change programs that are sort of low intensity, 20 sessions, there's no evidence they actually work. So it's the same, all the same principles come to the floor on that. But so what we do is we focus now for a long time on things like sexual offending. So in some states like Victoria, they have a whole division on sexual offending. They have different people that work with sex offenders compared to violent offenders. And of course the difficulty is where do you put someone who's both violent and a sexual offender? And so on and on down the list of different sorts of offending. We're seeing these things spring up, arson, and so on and so forth. And what we have shown in our work is that there are very few specialist offenders. And the vast majority of offenders who have significant reoffending are very, very heterogeneous in their offending. They're diverse offending. I'll give you some examples from our own work. So we'll start with sex offending, because sex offending gets a lot of attention. And around the world, this is very similar to other studies. This is a Victorian study where we've got about 650 male sex offenders who are assessed and treated through our statewide forensic mental health service. They're a very typical cohort. About 66% child sex offenders, the others adult or mixed sex offenders, and about 40% had some history of sex offending previously, and we followed them up on average about 12 years, and about 7% died during that time, so we took them out of the analysis. What we found is that the reoffense rate for sex offending is less than 20%, right? And that's what everybody finds. So the first thing you'll say is, well, sex offenders actually have lower reoffense rates than other people, right? You've heard that? Public don't believe it, but it's basically the fact. But what they're not telling you is that that's only if you look at their sex offending recidivism. If you look at their other reoffending, which is what this slide tells us, what you see is the people who are going on to reoffend, you see there's three types. Any offending, which are the top gray bars, violent offending, which are the mixed, the sort of orange bar, and then sexual offending, the blue bar. And you can see that mixed offending has the highest, so that's any offending, that's sexual or non-sexual, and you can see that the recidivism rates are now over 50%. If we look at violent offending in the orange bar, it's about a third, and again, it varies a little bit across the population of offender. The child sex offenders are more likely to be specialist offenders, but again, even there, 40% have some recidivism. So the problem is if we just focus on changing sex offending, we are not reducing offending. And in our case in Victoria, this man, I realize you don't get the media blasted the way we do with our stuff, but this man called Sean Price, who was on supervision and ended up basically killing a young woman at 17 in a public park, and he had a very serious history of offending. That's a great example, because he was being monitored on these sex offender programs, and he was seen as a very high-risk general offender, but not such a high risk of a sex offense. And therefore, he was being supervised really on the sexual offending. And obviously, his offending was violent offending and other things. So you see that if you're focusing on one sort of behavior and trying to change that, you could have all sorts of other things going on. So the message for you is that the most important management is not focusing on a specific offense type. That's highly problematic. It's focusing on the general criminogenic factors, because what you find is they relate to all of the offense types to a large extent. Now, this isn't just sex offending. The final point, and I realize you can't see these slides at all. So in our research, what we do is we follow up a lot of different people. So we have a great interest in stalking, and we have many, many cases of stalkers. So 160 cases here, 145 cases. We have every person who's been found guilty of arson in Victoria over a 10-year period, more than 1,000 of them. Sex offenders, I mentioned, and violent offenders. And what we do is we follow them up, and you can see the top line is general offending, and it doesn't matter what their kind of offense was, the general offending rates are all almost the same. They're between 49% and about 55%. You see, so it doesn't really matter. If you look at the very bottom line, which is their specific offending, say fire setting, 55% of people who convicted of arson reoffend with some offense, but only 5% of those people are reoffending with arson. Sex offending, I already gave you the data. Stalking is the only unusual one where about 50% reoffend, and for stalking it's about 30%. It's a bit higher than the others, but all of them follow the same pattern. So again, your job in particular in community corrections, it's a bit irrelevant to the community, is you can say, oh yeah, but he didn't sexually offend, you see? And that's what I almost said with Price, because he didn't. He killed someone, stabbed her to death. But then the next day he did sexually offend because he knew he was going to go to prison probably forever, and he had one hurrah. So the idea is the public don't care if you're reducing arson, sex offending, even family violence down the road. They're going to care about, is this person reoffending? Does that make sense to you? I can tell you a lot of people hate when I say that, because we do invest a lot in offense specific. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. That's critically important, but I'm saying it shouldn't stop there. That shouldn't be the end of it, particularly in community corrections. Now, if we focus then on offense types, this is what our research shows us. In our stalking population, we'll miss 20% of offending and 7% of violent offending. In our fire setting population, we'll miss 50% of offending and 30% violent offending. Our sex offenders, about 26% of offending and about 17% of violent. And of course, violent will miss 15% of general offending. So you can see this is a very important point in managing offending behavior. So we apply those R&R principles across people irrespective of their offense type in order to both intervene and manage their behavior. So this is really what we're saying, is if we just manage the specialist offending, you can see it's only 14% across all of our people of the sample are specialist offenders. And what we do, just to be honest, we don't just look at only one offense. We say, well, let's be fair, it's one or two offense types. It's the others then who have more diverse offending. Violent offending and, of course, general offending in our group, 61% had some kind of offense over 12-year follow-up. So this is, of course, something we need to deal with. So what can you do in community corrections to make this work? Well, again, you come back to the R&R. So we have to start with those principles. I realize it sounds like a broken record, and evidence shows that if we adhere to the principles, we can reduce offending. And that certainly happens in many, many studies and across populations. So across adult offenders, young offenders, violent offenders, female offenders, sex offenders, and so on and so forth. And this is what we always put up. So this, again, fairly busy graph shows on the left, those are reoffense rates. As the numbers increase, the reoffending decreases, so that's seen as increasing effect. And the numbers on the bottom are 0, 1, 2, 3. Those are looking at programs around the world that adhere to principles of R&R. So on the right, if they adhere to all three, it means they do risk, meaning they do a risk selection, they do criminogenic needs, and they address responsivity. The one with two, they'll do two of the three, any two, and then the first one is 1 and then 0. And what it shows you on the left is if you don't adhere to R&R, you get, those are actually increases in reoffending, and I've included both residential and community. And you can see in community in particular, what do you see? The more you adhere to R&R, the higher by far the effective is, because in community, that's again where you're teaching people to manage their way in society in a way that don't offend. So it has even stronger effects than programs in prisons and so forth. They need to work together, but the worst systems are systems that invest in prisons and forget about community, because all change occurs in community, and you need programs and bridging and supervision and so forth. Again, I don't have to tell you that, and like telling you to suck eggs. So the problems are around jurisdictions, not here, of course, is that not using up-to-date assessment tools. So the tools assist us in identifying and managing people. Failure to base interventions to assessment results, and it's a great problem for corrections because of the numbers of people we manage. It's very difficult, given your caseloads, to really to have individual case plans and programs in the way that we need to. It happens, but it's very challenging. And oftentimes, although again not here, some services don't use any risk need tools. So Victoria was doing that. They had no validated risk needs tool, and that was a huge problem because imagine somebody coming out of prison, and as a community corrections person, you don't really have a starting point of what's the person's risk, what are their criminogenic needs, what do we need to develop in terms of planning. That's very, very difficult. And then finally, if you do have that information, you don't do anything about it. And those of you in the regional areas, that's often more challenging because you don't often have as much available in terms of resources and services. So it is, I realize it's a challenge. Easy to say, hard to do. Again, similar results for men and women, young and old, prisons and community. I'm not going to talk about that, too complicated. So again, just back to the tools. Now, I know you use the LSI. Is that correct? You're still using LSI? Very good tool, validated over many years, and the validation data are very good from New South Wales. There are newer versions of the tool, particularly the level of service case management inventory, and what that's added, the LSI focuses mostly on risk and a bit on need. The LSCMI includes the whole idea around responsivity, and also, as you know with the LSI, it focuses on the criminogenic needs and the big 8, but it doesn't actually have other issues which are potentially criminogenic to be picked up. So these things have evolved over time, and there's probably some utility, people will kill me, in evolving to these measures. They're very difficult. Like we just worked in Victoria, we trained all their community correction staff in a new tool, 660 people in groups of 30. A huge undertaking, but I think an important one. So those measures are important. So what I want to do as I begin to wind down is I want to bring us to R&R community management. And what I'm going to do is whet your appetite for more in-depth discussion by other keynotes. So my job is really to set the stage, not to go into huge detail. Now, there has been work done, and the bad news, I should say, I'll give you the punchline first, is if you look even 10 years ago, as we heard Mr. Severin say, Boscar has done work and other agencies that show that people who are supervised have lower rates of offending, and same with people on parole. But usually, if you look carefully at that research, they're looking at during the period of supervision, right? And that's same with the monitoring. I'm uniformly despised for this comment. The research on ankle monitoring shows that it's ineffective in the long term. So it works really well when someone's wearing the bracelet, right? Because it's harder to do things. But that's kind of irrelevant. At least it's not irrelevant to you, but it's irrelevant in the big picture because we care about, are we changing their behavior over time? So even things like electronic monitoring, supervision of parolees, supervision of community corrections, the research was pretty bleak. It was showing that there's very little effect of that supervision over the long term. Not during the period of supervision, but over the long term. But that's the same as saying reoffending is reduced when people are in prison. Like, who cares? We care when they get out, and we care when they're not supervised. So if we look at the focus on community corrections, this requires a bit of change of thinking to begin to move these things. And it's really strengthening your role as an agent of change. Now, I sort of hate those cliches. In Singapore, they love those sorts of things, and they have the saying, captains of lives. So all community corrections and prison staff are captains of lives. They're changing people's lives, like sailing this ship. So what we're looking at is a focus on the offender's long-term behavioral change, not just during supervision. Now, I realize for you, the supervision period is the most important, and your biggest goal is to make sure people don't reoffend during that time. But for society, we need to make sure that we're going to have longer-term benefit. So this is what's happened is, well, how does this change? Well, you have to look not necessarily at the caseload size, although that is important. It's like classroom size for teachers. You have to look at the organization of the caseload. So if the more you have high-risk people, the fewer people you can supervise. And again, generally speaking, more experienced people who have maybe higher degrees of experience and so forth should be managing the more risky people. And they should often have high levels of managerial supervision, so there's good joint collaborative decision-making. Communication styles are very important. I'll touch on that. Referrals to appropriate programs and agencies. A, they have to be available, and B, people need to get to them. Again, in my review, which is mostly public, of people on parole who committed murder, not one of them made it to programs, and certainly most weren't even assessed, yet they ultimately killed people. And most of them, I should say, were high risk, about 80%. Some were, no one would have known. It's some low-risk drug guy who suddenly kills someone. But most were, people with pretty bad histories. Also, community involvement, not just programs. That's a huge issue around getting people to do pro-social activity in the community to fill the sort of void that crime used to have. And, of course, evaluation. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of these things as we go. So with caseload organization, these are things that are your bread and butter. The size, like I said, is important. More services for higher risk. Less services for lower, and ultimately the organization, and I know you do this, you have to make a decision that some people are so low risk that more administrative supervision than any real supervision. But there's nothing worse than wasting time with someone who's low risk, low need, where everything's going well. And we're sort of tempted to say, oh, well, it's good to at least check in on them. Yes, you can do that, but you don't need to manage them in the same way you're managing other people. Examine the concept of offense-driven caseloads. Like I said, I think in the end that's pretty difficult to have people focusing on one offense type. You often forget about everything else, and again, that's problematic. And of course, examine activities traditionally required in case management. So what you're really doing is case management of a range of issues. Now, these are the sorts of things. So we often just focus on compliance of conditions. And I know, having done lots of work with lots of states here and elsewhere, often that's your KPIs. Is that correct? It's looking at your compliance with conditions. So audits, not what the audits focus on. Now that's important, but what's as important is all the other things, which I'm not going to talk about, but it's beginning to change these behaviors, which are ultimately the criminogenic needs behaviors. That's what works. So communication style also. The offender has to be part and parcel of the process. So that's changed hugely over the years. That you are agents of change, they have to be fully participating. So gone are the days, and ineffective they were, where you just ordered people to do things. So there's very clear research that authoritarian stuff doesn't work. You're going to hear from Professor Chris Trotter, who's a real expert in this area, that stuff doesn't work. Also, encourage and reinforce change talk, continually look at the criminogenic needs, and of course, reinforce positive change as it occurs. And of course, one of the leading change agents is cognitive behavioral approaches. So you're not expected to do cognitive behavior therapy, but you're meant to understand the sort of principles of the relationship between thoughts, feelings, and behavior. And ultimately, things like motivational interviewing fit into that quite nice. And of course, what's really tough is you got to involve community partners. Everybody has to be on board. The courts, they don't get R&R. They don't really care about R&R, I can tell you. And same with parole boards. Usually, they think everybody needs treatment. It's like vitamin C. Everybody needs it. Remember, there was a big excitement about vitamin C a while ago, and people take major doses, and then the research showed you just pee it out. It has no effect. That's the same way for programs for low-risk people. They're unnecessary. I've seen lots of people who doing programs for the sake of doing programs, which they maybe don't even need. So you need the courts on board, parole board, obviously NGOs, community support groups, and they need to understand this, because all the NGOs I work with, they think what they do is why people offend. So I work with a colleague who I like very much, and she's a reading expert and language, and she thinks if you could just teach these people to read, they wouldn't offend. That's crazy, right? Lots of people who offend can read. But obviously, reading and verbal skills are important. Same with, you'll have groups who focus on a particular issue. Housing, if they had housing, they wouldn't offend. If they had education, they wouldn't offend. None of that actually matters individually. So, again, and it's very important to evaluate. That's the only way we ever know if something works or doesn't. And that's, in many ways, the downside of what I said. Now, also parole services, they need to be very sensible. And I realize it's very difficult the way our parole services are structured, because they're often entities almost of their own. But the systems are often not transparent. The board members, with all respect, often are very poorly trained, including judges. I've said this to them. You could be a judge, you could have been a barrister with 30 years experience, and you won't have a clue. They won't know what you know, right? They won't have a clue what people on the ground think, behave, and do. But they'll think they know because they've been around for a long time. Our parole board used to travel to all the prisons and have the senior judge sort of scold these guys. And he thought he knew offenders because his dad was a dock worker. But I pointed out with respect when I went with them, yeah, but you never were. You went to Melbourne University and graduated in law, and you've been a Supreme Court judge for 25 years. You're not a dock worker. You live in a very expensive suburb in a mansion. So you live in a very different world. So the parole services are very, very important. I know there's often a bit of friction with corrections and parole. And also, one thing we don't do well in Australia is graduated release as well as we could. And there's a real absence of things like halfway houses, where you can find a place for people that are intermediary. So I don't really know what you've got here. I know in Victoria there's really one facility that sort of does it. But if you go to other countries that do this well, they have many. And so it's a typical model where someone will start on day parole. So they'll basically be released to a facility where they're locked down overnight, but they're free during the day. They begin to work and get benefits and all these things. And then over time, that gradually reduces. Finally, with parole, it's structured parole decision-making. That's another problem. Very often, this decision-making, and again, I don't know what they do here. It may be perfectly good, but very often that decision-making is highly flawed. It's not arbitrary, but it's certainly not developed in a way that's very meaningful around how decisions are made. They don't really rely on empirical information and validated programs and so forth. So all these things are very, very important. And of course, their expectations are important. Not everyone will remain bad, and not everybody is going to change and be positive. So all of these services in community need to be looked at. So the final bit is applying the R&R principles in effective community supervision. And this is a teaser for what's going to come. So again, we've seen this. Adherence to the principles in community corrections changes behavior. I've said enough about that. The sad news is this is a very large set of studies. This is looking at 34 studies across general recidivism and violent recidivism. Those are the number of people. So 54,000 offenders who are general offenders and 29,000 violent offenders. And those little numbers on the end, that's how much they change as a result of community supervision. It's close to zero. Okay, so these are looking at studies of community supervision in a generic sort of way. So this is work that's the bad news. So again, in and of itself, people do a very good job while they're being supervised, but post-supervision, there's little evidence that people will really change on the group level. Obviously, individuals will change. So people began to look at this, and you're going to hear lots about this, the STIX program, which you're going to hear about later from another keynote. So they actually looked at one of the Canadian provinces, and they looked at what are probation officers doing. And some of the research is fascinating. You're going to hear it in more detail. They actually video and audio recorded your sessions. Wouldn't you love that? And then researchers looked at the communication. And what they found is, the first is the level of intervention proportional to risk, modest adherence. And what they actually found, for example, is often lower risk people you spend more time with. Why do you think that is? They're nicer, they come to appointments, they're compliant. That's who we spend our time with. If they're not coming to appointments, if they're not compliant, it's difficult, and if they're not very easy to work with. Does supervision target criminogenic needs? Not in the majority of cases. And again, you may be doing very different things than Manitoba in the middle of Canada, and our POs using cognitive behavior techniques inconsistently. So what they did in this program is they undertook significant training and development with community corrections staff, both parole and community corrections officers. And so they developed in-depth training and, much more important, skill development supervision. So training, I call it drive-by training. I do a lot of it. Danielle mentioned that. So I come to a city and I train people for, like say in Victoria when we did training on the LS R&R, I think it was 3-day training. So you come in, you got training for 3 days, and you go back. So that's called drive-by training. There's not necessarily supervision. No one in the office might really be more knowledgeable than anybody else. So that's, of course, important to have the training, but you need skill development, supervision, and this can be things, they did monthly meetings, clinical feedback, refresher courses. And what they then did is they evaluated through a randomized control trial how this works. Now, randomized control trial is the only way to really test these things. So people were simply randomly assigned to the sort of STIX program, which is an enhanced program, or supervision as usual. So that's how it worked. The people weren't pre-selected in any way. And what happened here is you can see the variables are attitudes. So if you look at the people who went through the more intense sort of training, and again, they weren't spending more time necessarily with these people, they're just doing things differently. The attitudes were changing. Also, they were addressing criminogenic needs in almost 2/3 of cases. Less time on non-criminogenic needs. And this is part of the criticism. You need rapport with the people you supervise, but the whole conversation shouldn't be about, say, a particular football match or listen and whinge about a particular issue for the period. And it shouldn't just be checking in. Right? It should really be systematically evaluating what's going on and are the criminogenic needs being met. And when that happens, it's actually good news. Now, the officer skills also improved. So the STIX group are the orange or gold bars, and the average ratings went up dramatically across all the areas of the work that the officers did. So all of the skills were enhanced that needed to be enhanced. And finally, of course, the good news is, when you get to the top of the mountain, the reoffense rates were dramatically lower. So if you look at reoffending, again, the microscopic numbers, they had a 37.5% reduction of offending in the people who were supervised, not any more time necessarily, but focusing very much on these sorts of principles, which is really what you're going to be taken up with by a subsequent presentation. So the idea is that what you do is critical and helpful, and I don't want to leave a negative message. It's very important during supervision people don't reoffend. That's the only way the public will have confidence in the service. And also, remember, when we say there aren't differences, still most people are not offending. The reoffense rates are, I don't know what they are here, about 40%, I imagine, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. So most people aren't reoffending. But what you want to do is continue to reduce the likelihood of people offending at the end of their supervision, right? And that's what we talk about in your conference, really. It's around agents of change and change behavior. So during supervision is critical, can't change that, but it's that post-supervision that's equally important. It's the only way ultimately to reduce reoffending, and it's reducing offending across all types. So these principles work across all types, including with respect to family violence. You may or may not know there's a very good program, very recently evaluated and published, again showing the same principles. If you have intensive programs for higher risk people, their reoffending is reducing by about 40%, which is very, very dramatic in that work. So congratulations on your work. I hope that this has been helpful in sort of setting the stage for some themes, at least raising questions in your head. And again, thank you for your frontline work and for paying attention to this presentation this morning. So thank you. Thank you.
I had the privilege of undertaking training with Professor Ogloff with the LSI R&R many years ago. And we talked about how the prediction of reoffending in the domain of education and employment scored so high, but may not have had such a real impact. Yet that, potentially that is a very high domain for our risk assessment, as you would understand. Has there been any change in that? And this was quite some years ago. Yeah. So has there been any change in that thinking? Given that is such a high scoring, or potentially a high scoring domain.
Yeah, that's right. Still important. All the 8 are critical. And education employment's very, very important. One of the difficulties is, and why attitudes and peers are the sort of top of the line, is A, they're very important, but B, they're easier to change. So changing someone's attitudes and the idea that you shouldn't hang out with these antisocial peers is easier than trying to make someone educated or employable. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing that. And so those education programs are critical and employment. But again, they are things that are generally more out of control for the individual. And let's face it, many of the people don't have a lot of capacity for these things. So we still need to do it, but we have to prioritize what we're going to focus on. So thank you.